Daily updates on positive COVID-19 cases and evolving government safety protocols to prevent the spread of the coronavirus has driven a surge in public relations and crisis communication services at Gavin. How can brands be proactive in their communications during a crisis? What can companies do to adapt for their recovery? Welcome to the AdLibber podcast, featuring conversations of influence. Some of it planned, much of it ad-libbed.
Thanks for tuning into the AdLibber. I'm your host, Jay Scott. Joining me on the podcast today is Mandy Arnold, Gavin's President and CEO, and Kim Myers, Gavin's first Director of Public Relations. Welcome to the AdLibber.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about crisis communications during the COVID-19 pandemic, get a sense of what some companies have been dealing with during this process and steps that they can take during the recovery. Mandy, I was hoping we could kind of jump into what we've been experiencing as an agency. A lot of companies have had, communications and marketing challenges during this. Can you give us a little sense of what we've experienced with clients?
Sure. So Jay, what we saw, as you know, at the onset of COVID-19 was clients kind of went through this whiplash where at the onset, they knew they needed to put together some sort of communications program. So that may have included a series of safety protocols. But what we saw was they jumped in quickly when they started realizing they had positive tests, because they immediately realized they had a responsibility for how they had to respond. And that was right about the time the CDC regulations were really coming down and the national media were paying closer and closer attention. At that point, we saw an escalation as clients started to realize that they were going to have enormous government regulations and safety protocols put into place. And then I would say the third phase really came in when clients started to see deaths. We had several clients, as you know, who had employees or consumers or students who had passed away because of an interaction at their establishment. And so, we've seen this constant evolution and escalation of what's been going on. And clients, I think, have gone through this process in a way that they have become hypersensitive, that they don't have all the answers, but they know they need to be proactively prepared with some form of communication. And then I would say, finally, certainly there's a sense of being in it together. We've explained to clients that you won't be judged for being in this circumstance. You will be judged for how you mitigated the risks and then also how you communicated through the process. Right.
Kim, how would you say this situation's compared to, past crisis events we've experienced, not just in this country, but maybe globally? We saw, 9/11's impact. We saw there's been incidents, mass shooting events in this country, and the response is always a little different. Like how do you think the communications have changed or shifted at all during this particular period in our history?
Well, having worked in Midtown Manhattan on 9/11, it was coming out of that disaster. What happened is I think companies started to realize that the issue of transparency was very important in their communications, just to be very open with their constituents on how they're handling certain crisis situations that are impacting their business.
Yeah, I'm sure one thing, speaking of 9/11, and Kim was there, she mentioned that I would say the big thing we're seeing now in crisis communications is mental health, behavioral health, which was a huge outcome with 9/11, and we're seeing that now with COVID. And I think clients, brands are recognizing the responsibility they have to manage the mental health of their employees. And to Kim's point, transparency and how they're making sure they are sensitive and aware of what's going on with their employees in this circumstance.
I think another thing we talk about a lot is being proactive, having a plan, and certainly periods like this, wake a lot of people up to want to suddenly develop a crisis plan for next time. Let's be prepared a little bit better. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the plan? Like, what should be in there? What are some key ingredients that we were recommending that clients consider as they develop and prepare for, not just the response to this situation, but the next one?
Yeah, and as you know, because we work with a variety of industries, everything from government to education, to healthcare, to business services, is that the crisis plan can look a little bit different for everyone. And typically where we start with clients is really asking them about their audiences, their target audiences, their stakeholders. What types of challenges do they anticipate? And what types of questions do they anticipate from those stakeholders and audiences in a crisis? And by starting with that point, we typically create a series of scenarios to then identify what are, let's say kind of the three zones. We've got kind of that quick issue that could escalate to a crisis. We have a short-term crisis that has a start and a clear endpoint. And then we've got that sustained crisis, like what we're in, and building out what a communications plan will look like for each one of those. And, a crisis communications plan can go 10 pages to, 500 pages, depending upon what type of organization you are. But we always recommend establishing who the decision makers are, who the approving entities are, those contact lists, the phone trees, making sure you have access to all of your communications tools and platforms, whether they're owned, shared, or paid networks. And so making sure there's that communications assessment at the onset is really essential. So what we've run into oftentimes is clients just don't know how they communicate with their audiences. When we start to poke and prod, we may uncover that they have a one-call system, perhaps they haven't wrapped their arms around, or they don't really have their email communications locked down so they can quickly communicate with their customers or their patients or their students. And so it really does start, to your question, it really does start at the onset by understanding who your audiences and stakeholders are, how you communicate with them, and what their concerns are going to be in each one of those crises, and then really building out your communications plan based on each one of those.
To Mandy's point, I think what happened coming out of the COVID-19 crisis is years ago when companies started doing their disaster preparedness plans, they forgot the importance of the element of communications. And so I think the one thing COVID has taught us is you need to have that component as part of your disaster preparedness plan.
And Jay, I know right before we jumped onto the call, we had talked a little bit about, when the history of crisis communications. And the first one, and certainly there were crises well before this one, but 1982 with the Tylenol tampering crisis was really the first corporate brand strategy that evolved. And Tylenol got plenty of pats on the back at the end of that as really the premier case study in the industry. And as Kim mentioned, that proactive assessment of communications, I think was that case study was one of the first that really said, Tylenol got front of everything and said, we're going to proactively communicate. We're going to proactively take control of the situation, and had lost enormous revenue when they took product off the shelves proactively. But because they actively communicated to all publics, all media and consumers and stakeholders and employees, people really appreciated the fact that they put the consumer safety first. And because they communicated that message and really justified their actions, they came out with increased sales the following year and one of the strongest brands that had ever emerged at that time frame in a crisis situation. So they really set the groundwork, I think, for every crisis communications professional, or at least it's in my age bracket. 1982, but that was the first big one in terms of historical references.
Yeah, right. I mean, now you run the risk if you're not being proactive, if you're being too reactive, the repercussions are going to be even more significant. It might not just be that current year, but long term, your brand could really suffer, right? If you're not jumping out ahead and communicating properly, people are going to whack you even harder these days.
Oh, sure. I mean, I will say brands are judged more, especially given the media fragmentation that we have, the 24/7 access to information. Brands are judged more for how they communicate today than they ever have been before. So if someone is slow to respond, someone maybe doesn't assume that it's important to communicate something, or they did something but then didn't communicate that their process was in place. So brands can lose brand equity and loyalty from not sharing communication on something, not being proactive, just as much as they could as not having a good product.
Yeah, and to Mandy's point, I think in terms of the fragmentation of audiences, I think what COVID has done is sort of brought back that humanization of your constituents. And so I think it's taught companies they need to learn how to better communicate across all of their platforms because their audiences are so fragmented, but yet they need to have that humanization level to their communications plan.
Right. I mean, I know another thing we've talked a lot about is, consumer spending habits during COVID. Certainly, we've all been buying things online more and more in recent years. And during this period where everybody's working remotely, it's happening at a greater scale. How do we begin the process, and what can we learn from this period of time in terms of helping a brand come out of it? How should they reach that audience a different way coming out of this in terms of shopping or any other spending that they might incur?
Well, I will say keeping all eyes on data right now If you go back to behavioral analysis, it takes 31 days to change a habit. So any brand right now has all eyes on, am I staying in touch with my customer base? Because if you think about how consumers change their habits and the psychological process of purchase power, it really comes down to staying in tune to how those habits are changing. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing it in rapid consumption of social media and news content, certain types of content. And we're seeing shifts in what people are buying. Obviously, essential products and services are at the top, but we're also seeing some changes in what people are investing in right now. So we're seeing people looking at their homes a little bit differently. They're reconsidering, what their home office is like, of course. And they're also reassessing. People are saving more money when they took a look at when people got those stimulus checks. One of the things the government did not anticipate was that more people were actually going to put that money away. And so, again, that comes out of an experience and a shift in behavior. And of course, it's very good people save money, but right now they really need them to spend it. So I think the big thing for brands right now is keeping their finger on the pulse of those changing data points and really looking at the industry trends, but making sure that they're thinking through how they're staying in touch with their customer base now. Because how their selling messages, their brand messages right before COVID are very different than what they are today. And assessing what that relationship, how it's going to adjust and make sure you're retaining brand consumerism in the process in an appropriate way so that we don't lose that consumer behavior pattern. I mean, that's the biggest fear on everybody's mind is, will my customer come back and make that purchase again?
Yeah, and to that point about trying to relate to your customer base in times of this pandemic, I think that tagline, "We're in this together," seems to resonate over social media over and over and over again. And I think what companies are finding is consumers are attaching themselves to local community-driven support networks to help local businesses stay afloat. And I think the bigger corporations are understanding that corporate social responsibility element is really, really important to consumers, and it's important to highlight that, particularly during a pandemic.
Right, that's a good point. I mean, considering the type of work we've been gravitating to in the last 2 months, more of the brands are focusing on how they're giving back to the community. We're trying to make sure everyone's aware of the opportunities that exist, but certainly you have to put the community top of mind and you have to do the things you've always done. You just have to make sure you're a little bit more cautious between, jumping too far ahead and focusing on the needs that exist right now, right?
Well, I think with the expansion of technology over the last 20 years, we've lost that humanization in terms of reaching out to consumers and engaging with each other. And I think that's, again, one huge positive aspect of coming out of COVID is, we're moving past just the digital advantages we've gotten through technology, but really trying to reestablish that human feel, that human touch to how we interact with consumers and other constituents.
To build upon that, I would say, the other aspect of the relationship too is how the receiver of the message interprets how the message is delivered. And I know if you guys think back to those first 2 weeks of when COVID officially became a national crisis, like officially everyone in the United States accepted the fact that we were in a pandemic, because there was kind of like a clear break in that process. Because I think there was a point where people were still living in their bubbles until they realized, oh, okay, this just isn't in the major metro markets. And what you saw in those first 2 weeks of advertising, if you guys think back, is every major brand rolled out an advertising campaign with the music. The music was all the piano, a specific tone. And I think that even the aesthetic, it was kind of like grayscale photos, starting to talk about, we're in this together, to Kim's point. And it was interesting because you probably saw about 25 of the country's powerhouse brands all roll out a similar advertising campaign. And all of a sudden, everyone realized, wait a second, I've got to really figure out what this authentic communication is for my brand. And so, as Kim was mentioning, this localized understanding of what's important to my consumer really became something that every agency, every PR agency, brand really started to assess. And so you're finally starting to see a shift in some of that advertising and even injection of some humor in brand messaging again, very subtly in appropriate situations. But I thought it was really interesting over the first 4 weeks, you saw this kind of repetitious, consistent status quo messaging. And some of it was because every creative director was stuck in his or her basement trying to figure out, how do I create an ad campaign when I can't go to a production studio? So, but it is really interesting, when you think through not only the message, but the vehicle by which the message is delivered to the end user.
How do you see that message pivoting here as we get into June, and we're coming up on a period in Pennsylvania where a lot more things are starting to reopen. A lot of counties are moving into different stages, and we're going to see more people out on the streets, doing outdoor dining over the next week or two. So certainly brands have to communicate a little bit differently now that it feels like we're getting to that next point. How do you see that evolving, and how will the message change, I guess, over the next few weeks?
Yeah, it's going to evolve at rapid pace. I mean, from us working with our clients, every client is a little different. If you've got a client in hospitality versus healthcare, those are two really different opinions on the situation. And so, I think the message is I think brands, you're going to have some brands, some organizations that are going to be a bit more aggressive because, their business is on the line, right? They need to figure out, how do I do this and be successful? Because they can't have a pop of interest from consumers and then it falls off because they move too quickly. And so I think you're going to see this balancing of safety messages continually being injected into the brand message, especially in the hospitality and tourism industry. There's going to be, I think, greater collaboration with a lot of the local governments because businesses are realizing, if I don't wrap my arms around this appropriately, I may move too fast, or I might have backlash. Because we've seen even regionally where our home office is, there are businesses that move very quickly and then there's enormous backlash. But, the other thing too, I think, is to really stay in tune to the opportunities to gauge your public's opinion on things. I know right now we're working with several entities to gauge consumerism and the return to normalcy. Do they have disposable income? Do they feel safe? And really analyzing that data based not only on their age and their geography, but just their personal preference of safety. So my hope is that our clients and those brands will assess their individual audiences and really get into their lens. Because, a 65-year-old consumer versus an 18-year-old consumer are going to interact with brands in these phases of opening very, very differently.
Right. It's certainly across industries, it is different. As you said, hospitality is very different from financial services. And, they've been able to, clients in that space maybe have been able to be a little bit more normal business. The stuff that they're doing, the interactions they have with their clients, a lot of it is, by phone, it is remote anyway. It's very different than the face-to-face retail side or face-to-face for another sector. So yeah, the way they're going to communicate coming out of this might be the same, but they're still going to be a little more guarded, I think, in some aspects. Like, they're still not going to want their workers maybe returning to the office in a full-time capacity. And how do they express that? What does that message look like is something I think we're all still trying to figure out as we get into the summer months.
I think companies have realized coming out of, again, through COVID, the opportunity to be very, very forward thinking. To Mandy's point, she brought me in right in the middle at the height of the pandemic because she thought ahead of the curve of what are my needs coming out of COVID-19. And I think a lot of companies are realizing that instead of taking a very reactive approach to their corporate needs and their communication cycle, they need to be very proactive moving forward in anticipation of, hey, we could get a second wave of COVID-19. How are we going to be prepared to handle that?
For the listeners who don't know kind of the other things I'm involved in, I also own a restaurant, so a fine dining restaurant with my husband. And so I think because that combined with crisis communication services, I was really hyper vigilant in keeping my eyes on those global and national trends, because I had actually, interestingly enough, several months ago been actually looking at viruses and pandemics and just happened to find it interesting. And so it was by happenstance that I just happened to have a little bit more information in my toolkit as this started to emerge. But when, in terms of making the decision quickly, I think because I was on the front lines in another business, it became very, very evident that I needed to be proactive. It became high priority for me that my employees felt safe, because you can't work if you don't feel safe. And when I started seeing things happening, I just kept thinking that I can't expect our teammates to be successful when we're asking them to be in an environment that perhaps may put them at risk. And then I also saw the other side as a member of the community and as a business owner that we were the first to make that decision in a lot of instances, closing the restaurant, deciding to go 100% remote at Gavin before we even had the governor's order. We did that because I personally believed that part of our core values was to take care of our employees first, and obviously make sure the business is also sustainable through any crisis. So those factors played quite large in the decision making to be proactive. I also knew that being a communications professional, and to what Kim was saying earlier, if we were communicating proactively and being transparent with our employees, with our teammates, they were going to trust us in the decisions that we were about to make. And I really needed our teammates to trust me as we started to go forward, because I knew behind the scenes that we had some really crazy things coming at us that we weren't quite going to understand how to deal with. And so by being proactive and communicating in advance, I knew that I was going to have some of that leverage to be forgiven for any potential mistakes we may make in our decision making, because we just didn't know what was going to be coming at us. So it was almost like internal brand equity building in my mind. And obviously responsibility was first and foremost. So that really was the thought process, and us being first to make those decisions, not only in our region, but a lot, in the industry as well.
Yeah, Mandy, in terms of making those tough business decisions, I think what companies are seeing right now, and I know we're working with some clients on this, is some of those business decisions aren't exactly in line with their constituents. And so they're having to realize the importance of a very fluid process in their communications, and why they're making the decisions they're making, and why it's beneficial to all of their constituents and in some aspects. And so I think they're finding immediacy is really important right now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Kim, you and I have talked to several clients already about the importance of weaving in those organizational core values. Don't lose sight of how important that is, because those really are your compass that gives you the ability and the authority to make decisions, and your employees will be right there with you. Because on the other end of this, if your employees are not committed to your organization, you got a problem, because you need to make sure you're able to hit the ground running if the market does return the way people are hoping. But also, your employees, especially for us, our employees are an enormous factor in our success, because clients rely on them. Clients need that consistency, because when our clients are in a crisis, they need our employees to be calm and steadfast in their commitment to services. So that was pretty essential in the process.
Yeah, and with regard to consistency, I think what companies are finding is the more consistency you have in your communications chain, the more credibility you're establishing. Because the second you go off course in your messaging, your constituents will start to realize, hey, wait a minute, they've said this before, now they're saying something different. So you need to maintain that credibility throughout the entire process.
Right. And I would just add, I know we talked at the beginning of the year, Mandy, about trends we were expecting to see this year, and internal communications was a big part of that. And a lot of this conversation, we've talked about how brands are responding maybe externally to their customers, but they have a responsibility to increase the level of engagement they have internally. Can you talk about that? Like how you think that will continue to be a driving force for the rest of this year and maybe well into 2021 even?
Yeah, I mean, I see it kind of as two scenarios. You've got clients who have to physically bring their employees back. And so communication is really essential, because safety is on everyone's mind. I mean, that's a big priority in every industry where they have to go back to the office. And we've seen many clients where they might have a safety plan, but because they don't communicate it, it creates flux and confusion and frustration. And that's usually when you start to see some kind of micro issues start to emerge that have the potential to turn into a crisis. In terms of those communications and how corporations make sure they're staying in tune to those things, and what we're looking ahead to, I think we're also going to see the other side of organizations that, like us, where we see remote workforce being a sustainable model for us. We're seeing increases in productivity, I'm sure, as a lot of other office environments are. And we have to figure out, how do we maintain our culture in that situation? So communications becomes a huge factor. How do we make sure we're staying in tune to our employees internally? How do we make sure they've got the information they need? How do we make sure we're bringing people into the fold? Kim was onboarded completely virtually. And, that was hot on my mind when we made the decision to hire her. We made sure we sent her a new hire kit, where she got all the goodies that Gavin typically has on site. we're constantly thinking through with our operations team, how do we make sure we leverage communications to make employees feel that they're very much part of this Gavin culture, because culture is so important in the process of success.
And I think it not only in the hiring process in a remote environment, but employee retention is really important. So you want to keep your good core, strong employee base. And so to do that, I think, again, a really transparent communication flow is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I guess the last kind of point I would add, just we're thinking about this process we just went through with hiring Kim. It was virtual interviews. Everybody's using Zoom for a lot of their daily communications with their staff. This process is going to be around for a while, I would think, right, Mandy? Like we're probably going to see more and more clients saying, hey, help us navigate this on the recruitment side. We need to reach people differently. How did you guys do it? What do you advise? This is going to be with us, right?
Yeah, and we're getting ready to go through that development of one of the office spaces here at the office. And one of the things we're thinking through is how do we prepare for that next level of video conferencing, that next level of kind of making sure people feel they're staying connected through this new form of communication that we were using, but we're using it at a hyper level we didn't anticipate, which I'm 1,000% on board with. And so trying to make sure that those interactions we're keeping them in a way that maintain that level of quality, not only for us, but with our clients. So thinking through what does that need to look like? What type of investments do we need to do? I mean, I'm really anxious I think one of the big things I see in this crisis right now is this is an opportunity to break the machine, break the rules, rebuild it, restructure things, think about new business models, come up with solutions that maybe you could not have pushed through, whether you're a brand or a business owner or whatever your role might be. This really is once in a lifetime opportunity to look at this. The silver lining is you have the chance to restructure, rebuild, reformalize some sort of strategy under new circumstances, and you will be forgiven for taking those risks now more than ever before. I know we've been encouraging, both of you know, we've been encouraging our internal teammates to bring new ideas to the table. How do we want to solve this? How do we come up with solutions for our clients that we may not have thought of 6 months ago? And we're seeing some new innovations come out, which I'm really excited about. As you guys know, we're looking at rolling out some new social platform support tools and reporting. We're looking at internal team management tools and using things like Microsoft Teams in addition to Zoom. So I'm very excited for what the future looks like. I think we're going to have a group of organizations and brands that emerge as the leaders because they were so flexible and agile. I think the ones who are really stuck in kind of a mindset and they struggle with change, those are the folks that are going to be left behind in what this new chapter looks like.
Right. I mean, Kim, you obviously, worked with companies B2B and B2C. How do you think they're going to break the machine, break the mold moving forward? Like, how does that look for some other industries that you've obviously interacted with closely and will continue to do so here at Gavin?
I think coming out of COVID-19, companies are going to start, to Mandy's point, to rely more on analytic data on how consumer behaviors are changing. And so the importance of having a really good, strong digital marketing program where you can track your consumer behavior, your current consumer base, and how to bring in new consumers to interact with your brand. So that digital marketing side of things is really where you're going to hone in on that data, figure out how to manipulate it, how to utilize it in and how you interact with consumers.
Right. I mean, I think it's going to have a big impact the way we're doing it. I mean, when you mentioned Zoom, you mentioned Teams, we're doing a lot more video conference work that I expect a lot of the content that you see from Gavin will slowly shift into more of a multimedia format as well. And, less maybe text heavy because people are so used to this now. You're used to like logging onto the computer. You've got meetings like this. You're checking out a video. Why should you not expect to continue to see that? It can benefit us long term.
It amazed me how instantly we saw TV spots with CEOs filming themselves on their phones. I mean, that is groundbreaking, and to your point, Jay, that these kind of delivery methods and people's level of acceptance of the way information is packaged to them, we're going to come out of this and things are going to look pretty different. I mean, what's on my mind is, are people going to value high production video as much as they did before? Because now they're thinking, the seal has been broken. They've been desensitized to, use of an iPhone in terms of recording videos, and CEOs are feeling more and more comfortable because they've been forced into this situation where they have to manage a communication with their own devices. And so it will be really interesting to see how people adapt and how the consumer adapts to a level of acceptability for different types of format of what that message is going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's a new world. I'm excited to see how it all transpires throughout the rest of the year. I really appreciate you guys both jumping on today to talk about this topic, because I know it's near and dear to our hearts. We're in it every day, but it's a good chance to kind of talk about what we expect moving forward. So thanks for jumping on the Ad Libber.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Ad Libber podcast. To find new episodes and get more content from our team here at Gavin, make sure to visit our website at adlibberpodcast.com. The Ad Libber is also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.